A white police officer tried to illegally build a case against a black woman in the park, treating her as invisible and guilty without reason. But when she firmly handed him the document of his own dismissal, his expression completely changed. The woman walked into the park and held a brown leather folder against her side. She wore a gray suit jacket and matching skirt. She had black pumps, low heels, and nude stockings. Her hands were dry from the cold. There were traces of light frost along the edges of the benches and on the grass by the main path. The air smelled like damp leaves, and her breath formed small clouds. She pulled her collar up, felt the fabric against her neck, and headed toward an old wooden bench near a small tree with naked branches. She had only a few minutes before she needed to leave for a meeting at the Central Police Station. She worked as a senior administrative officer. Her job involved reviewing internal misconduct cases in the police force. Inside her folder were documents that would finalize the termination of several officers who had engaged in serious misconduct. She had risen through the ranks over the years. She had attended night classes. She had dealt with subtle pressure and open doubt from some colleagues who never seemed to trust her competence. Now, she had authority to process disciplinary actions, including dismissals. The sky was gray, and a light breeze cut across her face. She sat down, placed the folder on her lap, and opened it. She flipped through the papers. Each page carried an official heading, a detailed account of violations, and signatures from the higher-ups. She had checked them before leaving her office. Now she checked them again. Everything was correct. She would deliver these documents soon. Her role was clear, and the steps were routine. She felt calm. She could not fail. The chain of command knew what she was doing. She had their approval and instructions. A jogger passed by without looking at her. A couple chatted softly near the statue at the center of the park. She could hear the faint sound of traffic in the distance. She closed the folder and rubbed her gloved hands together. Her feet felt the cold through her thin soles. Her stomach felt tight, but she was used to it. She had learned to stay steady under tension. She had learned not to expect encouragement. She had learned to rely on herself and the procedures in place. The documents in her folder represented a small step toward accountability. She was part of that process. She stood and adjusted her skirt. She decided to head toward the exit of the park. She would walk 2 blocks and reach the police station. There she would follow protocol. She would give the documents to the designated commander. After that, these officers would face the final step of their removal from the force. She had handled similar tasks before, though not always with such personal satisfaction. This time, one of those listed was known for harassing residents and suspects. She had read complaints that never made it to the public record. She had seen enough to know he deserved to be removed. She started walking. Her heels made a light tapping sound on the paved walkway. The air stung her cheeks. She noticed more details now. A man in a heavy coat feeding pigeons, a woman pushing a stroller, and an older couple leaning against the railing by the pond. No one paid attention to her. She liked that. She preferred to move without attracting notice. She didn't want anyone questioning why she carried official papers. She didn't want to explain herself to strangers. It was easier this way. As she neared a curve in the path, she saw a police officer in uniform. He was white, tall, and broad-shouldered. His dark jacket and hat were standard issue. She recognized the type. She had worked in the environment long enough to sense trouble when someone carried themselves like that. He stood near a lamppost, looking around. She couldn't hear what he said, but he was speaking into a small radio clipped to his vest. When he saw her, he stopped talking. His eyes settled on her. She felt the weight of that stare. She had done nothing wrong, but that rarely stopped certain types of officers from causing problems. She continued forward. Her plan was simple: act normal, keep walking, and ignore him. He had no reason to stop her. She was a senior administrative officer on official duty. She had proper identification. She had every right to be here. Yet she knew that in the real world, rights did not always matter to men like him. She gripped the folder tighter. "Ma'am," he called out, after she passed him by a few steps. His tone was flat. She stopped, turned her head slightly, and looked at him. She kept a neutral expression. She saw his eyes track the folder in her hand. She saw how his mouth tightened. She nodded, but said nothing at first. She wanted to see if he would give a reason to stop her. He took a step closer. She felt the tension in her shoulders. The officer looked at her face, then back at the folder, as if trying to read her mind. "Something I can help you with, officer?" she asked. Her voice was calm, steady. She kept her chin level. She wanted to make it clear she was not afraid. She had dealt with worse than a suspicious stare. She had the backing of internal affairs. She had the right papers. She was going to that police station with or without his approval. The officer hesitated, then said, "What do you have there?" He nodded toward the folder. His tone was not friendly. He spoke as if she owed him an explanation. She noticed how he stood, how he flexed his hand near his belt. She decided to keep it simple. "Official paperwork," she said, giving no details. He frowned. "Mind if I take a look?" he said. It was not a polite question. She could tell he was challenging her. She swallowed, tensing her jaw. She planned to refuse. She had no obligation to show him anything. She had identification in her jacket pocket, but she wanted to know his grounds for suspicion first. She made no move to hand anything over. Before she could answer, he stepped in front of her, blocking her path. She noticed how the few people in the park seemed to drift away. No one wanted trouble. She felt the cold air on her face and the tightness in her chest. She said, "Excuse me, officer, I need to be somewhere." He tilted his head, narrowed his eyes. He was not going to let her pass easily. Her heart rate went up a notch. She told herself to stay calm. There were rules, and he could not just stop her without reason. She thought about her meeting. She thought about the documents inside her folder. She considered showing her ID, but something told her that would not matter to him. She would hold her ground and see what he tried next. She took a slow breath and tightened her grip on the folder. The officer stood close, too close. She could see small stains on his jacket and a scratch on the badge pinned to his chest. His boots were wet from the damp ground. He gave her a once-over, focusing on her face, then on the folder, then back to her eyes. She kept her voice level. "Officer, I'm on my way to the station. I have official documents to deliver. I'm not obligated to show them to you here." He narrowed his eyes. "You're carrying official documents out in the open? That's unusual." His tone was blunt. He didn't move aside. She wanted to walk around him, but he shifted to block her path again. "I have an appointment," she said, "and I'm running late." She did not mention that the documents included his termination notice. She had no reason to tell him that. She only wanted to pass and continue to the station. "Please, I need to go," she added. She tried to be polite but firm. He looked around, as if checking if anyone was watching. A few people walked by, but none stopped. The park was quiet. He said, "What kind of documents are these? Let me see them." His voice was low and tense. He took a step forward, making her lean back slightly. She stood her ground, refused to back away further. She reached inside her jacket pocket and pulled out her ID card. She held it up so he could see it. "I'm a senior administrative officer. I'm authorized to carry these documents. That's all you need to know." Her fingers felt stiff from the cold. She tried not to tremble. He stared at her ID card but did not touch it. He seemed unsure for a moment. Then he said, "You got a reason to be in this park right now?" He took another step, forcing her to tilt her head up. He was taller and broader, and he seemed to enjoy crowding her space. She frowned. "I'm allowed to walk in a public park, officer." She tried to sound calm. She was calm, at least on the surface. Inside, she felt a spike of tension. This man had no reason to stop her. She had done nothing. She asked, "What exactly do you suspect me of?" He shook his head. "I don't like your attitude. People carrying official documents usually follow certain procedures. They don't walk around alone in a park. Show me what you have." He reached out and tapped the folder with the back of his hand. She pulled it away. "I'm sorry, officer, but unless you have a warrant or a specific legal reason, I don't have to show you anything." She kept her voice level. She wanted him to understand she knew her rights. She knew he should not touch her folder without permission. Still, she felt the knot in her stomach. She thought about what might happen if he tried to take it by force. He gritted his teeth. His eyes flashed with annoyance. "Don't get clever with me," he said. His hand hovered near his utility belt, but he didn't draw anything. He just stood there, imposing and rigid. "Step over here," he said, pointing toward a small clearing near a bench. "I need to check something." She refused to move. "Officer, I'm not stepping anywhere with you. I'm on official business and I'm late." She heard a slight tremor in her voice and cursed herself for it. She wanted to remain completely steady, but this man's stance made her uneasy. He nodded slowly, then moved quick as lightning. He grabbed the folder. She did not expect it. He yanked it from her hand before she could tighten her grip. She gasped and reached out, but he had already pulled it close to his chest. He opened the folder and flipped through the documents. His eyes scanned the pages. "Hey!" she shouted. "That's private and confidential. You have no right." She reached for the folder, but he turned his shoulder, shielding it from her. She glanced around, hoping someone might see this and intervene, but no one seemed interested. He squinted at the documents. She could see his jaw muscle twitch as he read the official letterhead, the case numbers, and the names. His breathing became louder. He shuffled a few pages, paused, then read something again. His expression changed. He went from smug to pale in a matter of seconds. She saw confusion in his eyes. He seemed to realize that his name was listed. She watched him swallow hard. He took a step back, still holding the folder. "What is this?" His voice cracked slightly. He looked down at the pages again, as if hoping he had misunderstood. She tried to snatch the folder. This time, he let her take it back. He was too busy staring at the paper he now held in his hand. He held only one sheet. She held the folder, missing one of the documents. She reached for that sheet, and he handed it over mechanically. He looked at her, blinking. His breathing sounded rough and uneven. She slipped the sheet back into the folder. "These are termination documents," she said. "You're named in them. They're official. They're signed." She spoke in a flat, factual tone. He said nothing. His face was tense. She saw the tension in his shoulders. He lowered his voice. "This can't be right. Who authorized this?" His tone was different now. He sounded nervous. He tried to stand tall again, but his posture had lost its stiffness. He looked around, as if searching for an ally or someone to confirm he was not dreaming. She tightened her hold on the folder. "I told you, officer, I have official business at the station. You've seen enough." She tried to step around him again. This time, he didn't block her path. He looked at the ground, then at her shoes, then at the folder. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She cleared her throat. "I need to go," she said. He did not respond right away. When he finally did speak, his voice was subdued. "This is a mistake, right?" He stared at the folder. "I never got any notice. You can't just show up with this." She shook her head. "It's not a mistake," she said. "I'm delivering these today. Everything is final." She tried to keep her voice calm. She didn't want to argue with him. She wanted to leave. She had shown more patience than he deserved. He stepped aside, letting her pass. She moved forward, careful and slow, not turning her back on him. She kept the folder close to her body. He stood there, stiff and silent. She heard him inhale sharply. He reached out, but not toward her, just a vague gesture in the air. "Wait," he said, voice low. "Is there anything I can do? This is my job, my career." She paused, looked at him over her shoulder. He seemed smaller now. The uniform didn't change, but his bearing did. She said, "I'm not the person you negotiate with. I'm just delivering what's already decided." She turned and kept walking. He didn't follow her. He stood still, watching her leave. She sensed his stare on her back. She didn't run, but she didn't slow down either. She felt the cold air in her lungs. She adjusted her grip on the folder, smoothing the papers inside. She needed to get to the station and hand everything over. That was all that mattered now. She kept walking, her heels clicking on the pavement. The rhythm of her steps became a soothing sound as she passed through the quiet park, away from the officer who had tried to intimidate her moments ago. She felt the cold air on her face, the sharpness of it reminding her that the day was just beginning. She could see the police station ahead, just 2 more blocks. Her steps seemed measured now, controlled. Even after the confrontation, she knew what she was doing. She had a purpose. Her heartbeat had returned to normal, but the tension in her shoulders remained. As she walked, the park seemed to move around her like a stage set. The joggers, the couples, even the leaves fluttering in the breeze, they were all just background noise. She, however, had a singular task ahead. It was clear this wasn't just another routine errand. The documents in her folder were more significant today. Today, it was more than just protocol. It was personal. The officer hadn't challenged her authority, only tried to undermine it. He had been looking for a reason to take her down, to remove the power from her hands. But she had stayed firm, moved herself past him. His confusion over the termination papers only confirmed he hadn't known. His reaction still hung in her mind, that split-second moment when his face paled, when he realized that she was the one holding all the cards now. Her hand gripped the folder a little tighter. She had handled internal affairs cases for years. She had worked through a gauntlet of skepticism, suspicion, and outward condemnation. But the hardest part had always been proving herself to people who didn't see her as an equal. That officer, directly in her path, was just one of many. She had seen enough, heard enough, to stand firm. His behavior, it wasn't out of the ordinary in her line of work, unfortunately. She crossed the street, noticing how the mood of the city changed. Cars no longer blurred by, honking or revving their engines in impatient bursts. There was an almost unnatural quiet on the block ahead. She picked up her pace. The sooner she reached the station, the sooner she could complete her task. She reached for her jacket pocket, feeling the identification badge tucked safely inside. That would confirm her position anytime it was necessary, but she doubted she would need to show it to anyone inside the building. She had never had a problem before. When she reached the entrance of the station, its heavy doors loomed ahead. A few officers stood sprawled at the desks by the windows in the lobby, their heads bent over paperwork. No one paid her much attention as she entered. She wasn't surprised. Despite her senior position, she had long been accustomed to the way others dismissed her role here. Women like her, Black women, had a way of becoming invisible, despite their professional titles or accomplishments. But not today. Today, she had something that no one here could ignore. Inside her folder, in black and white official records, was the end of a career, and that meant she mattered. She approached the front desk. The officer behind it looked up to meet her gaze. He was young, probably still in training, and his expression flattened when he saw her. She didn't hold it against him. The weakness in his posture, the immediate assumption that this was somehow out of place, it wasn't new. She glanced down at the folder as she set it on the counter between them. "Is Lieutenant Harris in?" she asked, keeping her voice even. She would not soften this request. No one here would take her lightly. "Lieutenant Harris?" The officer paused for a second, looking around as if trying to find him. "I think he's in his office." He motioned toward a hall to the side, a hallway that seemed to stretch into a tunnel with the fluorescent lights humming overhead. "Thank you," she said shortly, not pausing for further pleasantries. She picked up the folder. The officer hesitated for a moment, as if unsure what to do with her presence, but then returned his gaze to his desk work. The hallway smelled vaguely of antiseptic and old furniture polish. Her heels echoed in the narrow space as she approached Harris's office. She knew he wasn't going to be surprised. He had authorized this. The front-facing could be a hassle sometimes, but the chain of command had spoken. The documents were final. The people listed on them, including the officer she had just confronted, were getting their due. No questions, just procedure. That was the only thing that mattered today. Reaching Harris's office, she found the door was slightly ajar. She knocked lightly before pushing it open. Lieutenant Harris was on the phone, his back turned. She didn't wait for permission. She knew better. She stepped inside. "Lieutenant?" Her voice carried across the room, cutting through the phone conversation between him and someone on the other end. He put up his hand, signaling a moment of pause. "Just a second," he said, his brow furrowing. He barely seemed to see her, so caught up in the conversation. She wasn't offended. She knew this job wasn't glamorous. The important people worked behind the scenes after all. And today, she was one of those important people. As soon as he finished his call, he turned. "You're early," he said, standing up, slightly surprised. "There's nothing to wait for," she replied. She stepped closer to his desk, placed the folder in front of him, and added, "It's all here. It's done." He reached for the folder. She could see him process it, but she wasn't interested in his approval. She wasn't after praise for her work. None of the work she'd done had ever earned her that. She'd always been just a name in the system, just one more cog in the machine. He opened the folder to the marked section with the dismissal orders. She was about to leave as he picked up the papers, but then, without looking up, his voice lingered. "So, it's final," he said, as if confirming this for himself. "It's final," she affirmed, locking eyes with him. "All processed, signed, and ready." He nodded, scribbling his signature quickly. "Got it," he said, his voice now calm and matter-of-fact. It felt routine again, just another day in the life. Nothing extraordinary for anyone else, except for her. She turned to go and left the office in the same way. The hallway was quieter now, and she could hear the beats of her footsteps hitting the floor with purpose. Each step sent a quiet, yet firm message. She was done. That chapter was finished. Shall I continue with the fourth chapter, max 1,200 words? Por 13 segundos. She kept moving toward the park exit. Her heels struck the pavement in a steady rhythm. She tried not to look back at him. He was behind her, not far, but he had stopped following. She heard him call out, "Hold on!" His voice sounded strained. She paused, glanced over her shoulder, and saw him standing near the bench where he had grabbed her folder. He had his hand raised in the air, palm facing her, as if trying to halt her again. "I told you I have an appointment," she said. She did not raise her voice. She did not show anger. She wanted to keep control. "I have no time for this." He moved toward her, slower now. His shoulders were stiff, and his eyes flicked between her face and the folder clutched against her side. He said, "You can't just walk away. I need details about those documents." His tone sounded forced. He spoke more quietly, as if worried someone might overhear. She tightened her grip on the folder. "They're internal documents," she said. "I have clearance. You saw the ID. That's enough." He stopped a few steps away. There were 2 passers-by on the path, but they kept their distance, watching for a moment, then continuing on. He glanced at them and lowered his voice even more. "I don't understand. How is my name on that list?" he asked. He tried to sound calm, but his breathing was uneven. "Why didn't anyone warn me? I've been a good officer." She took a step backward, toward the exit. "That's not my call," she said. "I'm not here to discuss it. I'm here to deliver the papers. That's all." Her tone was flat. She didn't want to encourage him. She wanted to leave. He swallowed. "This must be a mistake," he said, almost pleading. "I've never done anything wrong." He looked around as if searching for someone to back him up. No one offered help. The few strangers who noticed gave them a wide berth. She shrugged. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you. If you have questions, take it up with the department after I file the papers." She turned her body slightly, indicating that she was done talking. The wind brushed her face, and she felt a slight shiver down her back. He reached out, not touching her, but gesturing near her elbow. "At least tell me what the charges are," he said. "I don't want to find out from a piece of paper. Tell me." He was trying to sound tough, but it came out weak. She looked him in the eye. She noticed his pupils were slightly dilated. His mouth was dry. He licked his lips. He looked nervous. "It's about conduct," she said. abuse of power, misconduct on duty. The department reviewed the cases. This is the result. He blinked, swallowed, and then tried to straighten his posture. You have no right to just end my career like this, he said, voice shaking slightly. I've been on the force a long time. Who signed off on this? She shook her head. I'm just the messenger, she said. The decision is final. There's a chain of command. Everything is documented. Everything is legitimate. She wanted to leave now. This conversation served no purpose. He glanced down at the ground, then back at her. Look, he said, voice barely above a whisper. I was just doing my job. Those complaints, they mean nothing. People lie. You know how it is out there. He sounded defensive. She held his stare. I'm not here to argue, she said. My job is to deliver these documents. Once I hand them in at the station, it's over. There's no going back. She did not smile or frown. She kept it neutral. He took a step closer, lowering his voice even more. But listen, he said. Maybe we can work something out. You haven't filed them yet, right? His eyes flicked toward the folder. You could say you lost them, or that they got damaged. Give me a chance to fix this. She felt a surge of irritation. That's not happening, she said firmly. This is official. You saw the signatures. I'm not risking my job for you. That would never work anyway. She turned her body again, aiming toward the park exit. She had wasted too much time. He sighed, looking desperate. Please, he said, voice tight. You know how hard I've worked. Don't do this to me. She faced him once more. I'm not doing anything to you, she said. This is the consequence of actions that were investigated and confirmed. I just carry the papers. She pointed toward the street beyond the park. I'm leaving now. I suggest you prepare yourself. He stared at her for a moment, then looked away. His shoulders slumped. He glanced at the ground, then kicked a small pebble aside. When he looked up, his eyes were red at the corners. He didn't argue further. He just stood there, defeated. She turned and walked away. She kept a steady pace. Her heels clicked on the path. She tightened her hold on the folder and tried to calm her breathing. She had not expected him to try bargaining. That was a foolish move on his part. It showed how desperate he was. She did not feel sorry for him. He had tried to intimidate her. He had crossed a line by grabbing her documents. He did not deserve sympathy. As she neared the park's exit, she checked the time on her phone. She still had enough time to reach the station on schedule. She could deliver the papers and complete the process. That was all that mattered. She had done what was required. He knew now that he had been caught, that the department was done protecting him. She stepped off the park's path and onto the sidewalk. She heard no footsteps behind her. He was not following. She didn't look back. She focused on her destination. The station was only a couple of blocks away. Soon, she would be in a controlled environment, handing the documents over to the commander, making the entire thing official and final. There was no reason to linger on what just happened. She had been confronted, but she had not backed down. The documents were safe. The station awaited her. She adjusted her collar, walked past a small coffee shop, and waited at a crosswalk for the light to change. She kept her expression neutral. This was just another task she had to finish. She was almost there. She stepped off the curb, intending to head straight for the police station. She heard a scuffling sound behind her. She glanced back. The officer was approaching again. He looked pale, as if he had run a long distance. He raised a hand, not in a threatening way, but as if asking her to slow down. She stopped and faced him. Her posture was rigid. She held the folder close to her side. He cleared his throat. His voice was uneven. Listen, he said. I need to know who authorized that paperwork. I deserve to know. He stood there, a few steps away, his boots scraping the sidewalk. He tried to sound in control, but his words came out stiff. She took a breath and replied, I told you. I'm delivering official termination documents. They're approved and signed by those with the authority to do so. She spoke calmly. She maintained eye contact. She did not step closer. She saw his cheeks twitch and his breathing come in short bursts. He looked at the folder again. I've never seen anything like this, he said. This is so sudden. His voice dropped even lower. I thought I had support inside the department. I thought I was safe. He sounded confused. She saw sweat at his temples, despite the cold air. She tightened her grip on the folder. If you have a complaint, file it at the station, she said. I'm not the person who made these decisions. I'm just here to deliver the results. She took one step to the side, intending to move around him and continue walking. He adjusted his stance, not blocking her, but still lingering. He raised his voice slightly, looking around to make sure no one was listening. You don't understand, he said. I had a good record, or so I thought. Someone must have set this up. His words came out rushed. He tried to regain some measure of authority. Tell me who signed those documents. I have the right to know. She shook her head. I'm not discussing this, she said. The information is in the file. Once I file it officially, you'll be contacted through the proper channels. She wanted to finish this conversation now. She shifted her weight and looked past him, toward the route that led to the station. He clenched his fists at his sides. I saw my name there, he said, his voice louder. I saw it. This can't be final. You're carrying them, so maybe it's not official yet. Maybe I can talk to someone before you drop them off. He took a half step forward, lowering his voice again. Give me a chance. She kept her gaze steady. It is official, she said. It's not a draft. It's the final step. After I hand these in, it's done. Her voice had no trace of sympathy. She just stated the facts. I'm going now. He let out a short, strained laugh. I can't believe this, he said. He glanced around, as if expecting someone to appear and contradict her. When no one approached, he tried another tack. Look, you can't blame me for being upset, he said. I worked hard. I put in years on the job. She raised a hand, palm out. Stop, she said. This isn't my problem. I'm not interested in what you did or didn't do. I'm late. She stepped forward, and this time he did not block her. She passed him, stepping onto the sidewalk in front of a row of trees that lined the street. He turned to face her, taking a few quick steps to keep up. He spoke in a hushed tone. At least tell me if I can appeal this. Is there a process? He sounded desperate. His voice wavered. She nodded without looking at him. The department has a protocol for appeals, she said. Once the documents are filed, they'll contact you. That's all I know. She focused on moving forward. The station was not far. She could see the top of the building from here. He caught up to her and walked beside her, maintaining a small distance. His voice was tense. I don't want to cause trouble, he said. But you caught me off guard. This could ruin everything. Can't you understand why I'm trying to get more information? She gripped the folder so hard her knuckles ached. I understand you're upset, she said. But that doesn't change my job. I'm delivering these documents. I'm following orders. She kept her eyes on the sidewalk ahead, scanning for any obstacles. He moved in front of her, arms at his sides, trying to appear calm. Just give me a name, he said quietly. A supervisor, a commander, someone I can talk to before it's too late. She exhaled. I'm not giving you any names. She stepped to the side and continued walking. He hesitated, then followed again, now a step behind her. She could feel his presence. She could hear his breathing. She wanted to tell him to back off, but she decided to ignore him unless he physically interfered again. After a few moments, he spoke again, voice tight. If I show up at the station right now, can I talk to them before you hand those in? She shook her head. They expect these documents. Once I arrive, it's out of my hands. You can show up, but it won't stop anything. She hoped he would give up. He fell silent, steps slowing. She kept her pace steady. After a dozen steps, she glanced back. He had stopped near a lamppost, shoulders slumped. He stared at the ground. She faced forward again and kept walking. The only sounds were cars passing on a nearby street and the shuffle of a few pedestrians minding their own business. She reached the corner and waited for the signal to change. She noticed a reflection of herself in the window of a closed bakery. She looked composed. She held the folder tight, but other than that, she appeared calm. That was all she wanted. to keep control and finish her task. The signal changed, and she crossed the street. When she looked back once more, the officer still stood by the lamppost. He didn't move, he didn't call out, he just watched her go. She turned away, fixed her eyes on the direction of the station, and kept walking. She kept a steady pace, moving closer to the police station. The traffic on the street was heavier now. Cars passed by slowly. A delivery truck stopped at the curb, and a man hopped out, carrying a box toward a small convenience store. The station was just a short walk away. She checked her watch and noted that she was still on time. She gripped the folder, making sure the papers were secure. Behind her, the officer had lingered by the lamppost. She glanced back once and saw him run a hand over his face. He hesitated, then started moving again. She turned away and continued walking, hoping he would give up and leave her alone. She had given him enough information. There was nothing more to say. She stepped around a puddle near the curb and adjusted the collar of her jacket. She felt the bite of the cold air on her cheeks. The folder was slightly damp at the edges from the park's humidity, but the documents inside were safe in their clear sleeves. She wanted to reach the station, hand them over, and be done. This day had started simply enough, but now she carried the residue of an unpleasant confrontation. She heard footsteps behind her. She slowed, then stopped. She looked over her shoulder. The officer had crossed the street and was approaching her again, this time at a slower pace. His face looked drawn. He breathed through his mouth. He raised one hand, signaling he wanted to speak. She did not move. She waited, feeling a hard tension in her gut. He stopped about 2 paces away. "I'm sorry," he said in a low voice. "I'm not trying to scare you or cause a scene. I can't believe this is happening. I want to understand who decided it." He looked around. Several pedestrians passed them, ignoring the exchange. The city noise was a constant hum. She replied without emotion. "I understand it's difficult, but I already told you all I can. The department made the decision. I am delivering the final paperwork. There's nothing else for me to say." She spoke clearly and kept her eyes on him. She wanted him to see that she would not budge. He nodded slowly, pressing his lips together. He glanced at her shoes, the folder, then back at her face. "You know me?" he asked softly. "Did you ever hear my name before today?" He sounded unsure, as if searching for a connection that might change her mind. She shook her head. "I process many cases. I don't have personal ties to them. Your name is just one on a list. I have no direct knowledge of your history." She saw him flinch at her words, but she refused to soften her tone. He exhaled. "So, you're just the one who carries the bad news," he said. There was a trace of bitterness in his voice. He paused, then spoke again. "Can't you at least tell me what report sealed my fate? Was it one incident or a pattern?" She set her jaw. She was not supposed to reveal the details outside the proper setting. "It's not my place to discuss specifics here," she said firmly. "I have to deliver these documents as they are." She shifted her weight and looked down the street. The station's sign was visible now, a few blocks away. He nodded, chewing the inside of his cheek. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets and looked at the pavement. "I guess that means I have to wait," he said. "Wait until they officially hand me my notice and all the reasons that come with it." His shoulders sagged. He looked up again, squinting against the dull light. "This hits hard," he said quietly. She did not respond. She had nothing to add. His problems were not her concern. She had a job to do, and it was clear he was trying to squeeze out any scrap of information or sympathy. She would give him neither. She took a step forward, intending to walk around him and continue on her way. He saw her move and shifted to let her pass. He did not block her this time. He turned slightly as she moved by. "You know," he said in a flat tone, "I never thought I'd lose this job. I thought my record was clean enough. Maybe I stepped on the wrong toes. Maybe I handled a call in a way they didn't like." She did not pause. "If you have questions, ask them at the station once the termination is official," she said over her shoulder. She had repeated herself enough times, and she was tired of this back and forth. She kept walking, expecting him to give up. He followed, staying about a step behind and to the side. He did not try to stop her physically. Instead, he spoke quietly. "Tell me something. When you deliver these documents, do you ever think about how they affect people's lives?" He sounded resigned now. She gripped the folder tighter. "My role is administrative," she said. "I ensure the process is followed. That's it." She would not engage with the moral angle. That was not her responsibility. The system had decided his fate before she stepped into the park. They reached an intersection. She waited for the light to change. Cars rumbled by. A bicycle bell rang somewhere behind them. He stood next to her, quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I guess this is it. Once you file those papers, I'm done." She glanced at him. He looked tired, defeated. "Yes," she said plainly. "That's how it works." She crossed when the light changed and he followed without comment. She wondered if he would try one last plea, but he remained silent. They moved closer to the station. She could see the familiar brick facade and the sliding glass doors at the entrance. 2 uniformed officers stood near the door, talking. They did not notice her yet. She slowed her pace slightly. She did not want to arrive with this man still following her. He seemed to sense her hesitation. He stopped a few yards short of the station's entrance. He looked at the building, then at her, and said, "So you'll just walk in, hand them over, and that's it?" She nodded. "That's it," she said. "It's straightforward." She kept her voice neutral. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I can't stop you, can I?" he asked. His voice had no edge now, no threat. He knew the answer. "No," she said simply. He looked down at his boots. He breathed out slowly, then raised his head. "All right," he said. "I won't try to stop you." He stepped back, giving her space. "You do what you have to do. I'll deal with it." She gave a brief nod and walked forward. He did not follow. As she approached the station doors, she glanced back. He stood where she left him, arms at his sides, shoulders slightly hunched. He stared at the ground. She turned away and stepped inside the station lobby. The warmth hit her face, and she took a moment to adjust to the change in temperature. Now she could finish what she started. She stepped into the station lobby and let the door slide shut behind her. The interior was warmer and brighter. A few people moved about, talking in low voices. An officer at the reception desk looked up, gave her a brief glance, then returned to his paperwork. She walked toward a set of double doors that led to the administrative wing. She knew the way. She had been here before for other assignments. Her heels clicked against the polished floor. She passed a bulletin board with notices pinned in neat rows. She saw posters reminding officers to follow protocols. The air smelled like coffee and disinfectant. She reached into her jacket pocket and retrieved her ID card. She would need it to pass through a security checkpoint. A uniformed officer stood guard, tall and broad, arms crossed over his chest. He watched her approach, then extended a hand. She gave him her ID. He studied it for a moment, then looked at her face. "What's your business here?" he asked in a flat tone. "I'm delivering official termination documents," she said. "I have authorization. I need to see the commander." She kept her voice steady. He returned the ID card and nodded. "Go straight down this hall. The commander's office is at the end, to the left," he said. "You should check in with the administrative clerk first." He gestured toward a door off to the side. She thanked him and moved on. In the corridor, the sound of her steps faded on the carpet. She reached a door marked Administrative Clerk. She knocked, then entered. Inside, a clerk sat behind a desk, typing on a computer. She was a woman in her 50s with short hair and tired eyes. The clerk looked up and raised her eyebrows. "Can I help you?" she asked. She held out the folder slightly. "I have final termination documents that need to be delivered to the commander," she said. "I was instructed to bring them directly." The clerk nodded slowly. "Do you have a release form or a memo authorizing direct delivery?" she asked, leaning back in her chair. Her voice was calm, but she clearly wanted to confirm everything was in order. She slipped a small envelope from the folder's front pocket and handed it over. The clerk opened it, read the note inside, and nodded. "All right, this looks proper," she said. She pressed a button on her phone. "Commander, the delivery from the administrative office has arrived." A muffled voice came through the speaker. The clerk nodded and said, "Yes, sir." She looked at the woman and said, "You can go in, straight down the hall. Last door on the left." She thanked the clerk and stepped out. She walked down the corridor. The lighting was neutral and even. She heard distant voices and the hum of office equipment. Each door had a nameplate. She passed a few closed doors, all quiet, then reached one labeled Commander. She adjusted her hold on the folder and knocked twice. "Enter," a voice said from inside. She opened the door and stepped into a modest office. A large wooden desk stood near the back wall. Shelves held binders and some basic office supplies. The commander sat behind the desk, looking through a stack of papers. He was middle-aged with a stern face and a trimmed beard. He glanced up at her, then nodded toward a chair. "Have a seat." She closed the door and sat down, placing the folder on her lap. She offered her ID and the envelope to him first. He took them, read the note, then handed her ID back. "So, these are the final documents," he said. He tapped the envelope on the desk, then set it aside. "I was informed this would happen today." She opened the folder and showed him the papers inside. "Yes, sir," she said. "Everything is signed and authorized. I've been instructed to deliver these to you for immediate processing." She kept her tone level and professional. He nodded and leafed through the documents. He paused at one page, frowning slightly. "All these officers are to be terminated immediately?" he asked, looking at her for confirmation. "Yes, sir," she said. "These cases have already gone through the internal review. My role is to finalize the delivery." She shifted in her chair, keeping her posture straight. "I was told to ensure you received them personally." He looked through more pages, then set them down. He pressed a key on his phone. "Send in Officer Ryan," he said to whoever was on the other end. He released the button and sat back. "I need to assign someone to log these into our system. Should only take a moment." She nodded. She kept quiet, waiting for instructions. She heard footsteps in the hallway, then a knock on the door. "Come in," the commander said. The door opened and a younger officer stepped in. He wore a crisp uniform and held a small tablet device. "Ryan, these are termination notices," the commander said. "I need them logged immediately. Transfer the details into the internal database. Make sure they're coded as final." He handed the stack of documents to Ryan. "Do it now, please." Ryan nodded, took the papers, and moved to a side table. He began typing data into his tablet. The commander watched for a moment, then looked back at the woman. "Everything appears to be in order," he said. "We'll have these processed by the end of the day." She felt relief. She had done her job. She had brought the documents where they needed to go. "Is there anything else you need from me, sir?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, I think that covers it," he said. "Your office sent a memo explaining the procedure. You've followed it exactly. Thank you." He reached for a pen on his desk and signed a receipt form. He handed it to her. "This is your confirmation. Keep it for your records." She took the receipt and slipped it into her folder. Without the termination documents, the folder was much lighter now. "Thank you, sir," she said. She stood up, straightened her skirt, and moved toward the door. "Have a good day," he said, turning his attention back to his own stack of paperwork. She stepped into the corridor. Behind her, the door closed softly. She knew that the officer from the park would soon receive official notice. It was no longer her concern. She had delivered the documents. The process would continue without her involvement. As she headed back toward the lobby, she passed the administrative clerk's office. The clerk looked up, gave a slight nod, and went back to work. The hallways were quiet. She thought about leaving the station and returning to her office. She could report that the task was completed. Everything had gone smoothly once inside. When she reached the reception area, the officer behind the desk was still busy with paperwork. She walked straight out the front door and onto the street. The air outside felt colder after the warmth of the station. She zipped her jacket and tucked the folder under her arm. Now she could focus on her next tasks. This one was done. Thoroughly done so far. Would you like to proceed with the 7th chapter? Or would you prefer additional changes first? Por 5 segundos. She walked away from the station entrance and down the sidewalk. The traffic noise was steady. She held the now nearly empty folder under her arm. Her ID card was back in her pocket. She had the receipt confirming that the documents were delivered. She passed a small bus stop and saw a few people waiting quietly. She did not look at them. She kept moving at a normal pace, heading toward her office. The wind blew against her face, making her eyes water slightly. She adjusted her collar and kept walking. Her mind was on the next steps. She would return to her department, report that the delivery was completed, and then handle any routine paperwork that awaited her. That was the standard procedure. She had done this before, though not with the same tension as today. Still, the task was done. She had followed instructions. She reached a corner store and decided to stop for a coffee. She stepped inside. It was warm, and the smell of brewed coffee was strong. She joined a short line, waited, and then asked for a small black coffee. She paid in cash, took the paper cup, and stepped outside again. The warm liquid helped ease the dryness in her throat. Walking again, she passed a few people going about their day. None of them paid her any attention. She was just another person in the city, holding a folder and a coffee. She liked that. She preferred to be unnoticed. There was no reason for anyone to care about her business. She sipped her coffee and kept her eyes forward. She turned onto a quieter street. Some shops were closed. A few office buildings lined the block. She recognized a post office and a pharmacy. She passed a florist's window. The flowers were arranged behind the glass, bright colors under artificial lighting. She did not pause. She had no reason to buy anything. She only had a few blocks to go until she reached her own building. She thought about the officer she had encountered in the park. She remembered how he had tried to stop her, how he had grabbed her folder, how he had pleaded after reading the documents. It was over now. He would soon receive formal notice. He would have to address his situation through official channels. She was no longer involved. She had done her part. The department would handle the rest. She finished her coffee and tossed the empty cup into a trash bin on the sidewalk. She paused to adjust the folder under her arm. She ensured her ID card was secure in her pocket. She took a breath and continued walking. The day was still cold, but she had grown used to it. A delivery person passed by on a bicycle, a large bag strapped to the back. A car honked at a van blocking an alley. A woman in a long coat hurried past, checking her phone. Normal city sounds and sights, nothing unusual. She reached her office building, a gray structure with tinted windows and a revolving door at the entrance. She stepped inside and felt the warmth of the lobby. The security guard at the desk nodded at her, recognizing her from her frequent visits. She nodded back, walked toward the elevators, and pressed the button. A soft chime sounded, and the elevator doors opened. She entered, pressed her floor number, and watched the doors slide shut. The elevator ride was smooth and quiet. She glanced at her reflection in the elevator's stainless steel panel. She looked composed. Her jacket was neat, her hair in place. She appeared calm. That was how she wanted to be seen. She had a job, and she did it. That was enough. When the elevator stopped at her floor, she stepped out into a corridor lined with office doors. She walked to her office, unlocked it with a key card, and entered. Inside, the air was still and quiet. Her desk was where she had left it, with a computer monitor and a small stack of papers. She turned on the desk lamp and placed the folder down. She took the receipt form and scanned it into her computer system. She added a note confirming the time and place of delivery. She double-checked the instructions. Everything matched what she had been told to do. She saved the files. She placed the original receipt in a filing cabinet and locked it. Now that the main task of the day was done, she could return to her regular duties. She would update spreadsheets, answer emails, and process any new requests that came in. She turned on her computer and opened her inbox. There were a few messages from colleagues, none of them urgent. She began to sort through them, prioritizing what needed attention. There were no dramatic changes to her schedule. She had done what was required. The system would handle the rest. She clicked through a few files, organized some folders on her computer, and then checked the time. She considered whether she should break for lunch soon or wait. She decided to wait. She preferred to finish a few tasks first. Outside her office window, she could see the tops of buildings and a sliver of gray sky. The weather had not improved, but that was normal. She did not mind. She had no errands until later. She typed a brief report summarizing the delivery. It was a standard form. She filled in the date, time, the names of the officers affected, and the name of the commander who received the documents. She kept the language clear and factual. With the report saved, she sent it to her supervisor. She knew it would meet the required standards. She had followed the rules. She had encountered an obstacle on the way, but it had not stopped her. She returned her ID card to her jacket pocket and leaned back in her chair. Now it was just another day at work. Everything was in order. Her inbox was manageable. Her schedule was clear. She had done what she was supposed to do, and the rest was out of her hands. She reached for her office phone, checked for messages, and found none that required immediate action. She turned back to her computer and began working on the regular administrative tasks that filled her hours. There were always files to review, forms to update, and data to enter. The job was steady and predictable. She appreciated that. There was no sign of the officer from the park. He was far away now, dealing with the consequences of his actions. She had no need to think about him anymore. She had provided the termination documents. The department would inform him through official procedures. That was the proper way. As she clicked through the day's tasks, the time passed at a normal pace. She had coffee in her mug and papers in her tray. The sound of distant phones ringing and muted voices filtered through the office walls. Everything was normal. Everything was calm. She worked at her desk for a while, updating records and confirming that all documents were properly filed. She typed short notes into the department's internal system, checked references against a list of personnel files, and printed a few confirmation sheets. She sorted the printed sheets into a folder on her desk. The office was quiet, except for occasional footsteps in the hallway and muffled voices drifting from other rooms. A junior administrator stopped by her open door and asked if she needed any assistance. She said she was fine and thanked him. He nodded and left without further comment. She continued scanning documents into a digital archive. The process was routine. Open the scanner's lid, place the paper, press the button, wait for the confirmation on the computer screen, then move on to the next page. After finishing a batch of scans, she checked her email again. There was a new message from her supervisor. It was a brief note confirming that the termination documents had been received at the station and logged correctly. The supervisor thanked her for completing the delivery on time. She replied with a short acknowledgement and returned to her tasks. Outside the window, a light drizzle had begun. She could see small droplets on the glass. A gray haze covered the city's rooftops. The lights in the office were steady, and the air was warm and dry. She took a sip from a water bottle, placed it down, and tapped on her keyboard to open the next file. The day proceeded without interruptions. She reviewed a set of standard forms and made sure they followed the proper format. She flagged a couple of errors in a draft report prepared by another colleague and sent it back with a brief note. She double-checked a personnel list for accuracy and saved her changes. Around midday, she decided to take a short break. She left her office, walked down the corridor, and entered a break room with a small kitchenette. She poured herself a cup of hot water and steeped a tea bag in it. She leaned against the counter, sipping slowly. 2 other employees were seated at a small table, eating their lunches and talking quietly. She listened without joining the conversation. She had nothing important to add. After finishing her tea, she washed the cup and returned to her office. The folder on her desk was now organized. She placed it in a cabinet and locked it. She focused on updating a spreadsheet that tracked recent administrative actions. She entered the date, the type of action, and the relevant case numbers. She confirmed each entry twice before saving the file. By early afternoon, she had completed most of her immediate tasks. She checked her email again. No new urgent requests. She reviewed a weekly report template and made a note to fill it out before the end of the day. She straightened a pile of papers and placed them in a storage box on the floor beside her desk. The office routine continued at a steady pace. A phone rang down the hall. She heard someone pick up and speak in a low tone. The sound faded into the background. She stretched her arms slightly, then sat straight and resumed working. She updated a personnel schedule with the changes requested that morning, carefully entering the correct start and end dates for each staff member. The rain outside continued, tapping lightly on the window. She glanced at her watch, noting the time. Everything seemed under control. The tension from the park encounter felt distant now. She had done her duty. The documents were delivered, and the system was handling the aftermath. She had no reason to think about it anymore. She typed a short note in a shared document, verifying that a certain set of records had been transmitted successfully. She saved the file and leaned back in her chair, scanning her to-do list for any remaining tasks. Most items were checked off. She decided to finalize the weekly report now, rather than wait until later. She opened the report template and filled in the required fields. She listed the documents delivered, the time of delivery, the recipient's name, and the confirmation number. She added a brief line stating that the process went according to protocol. She saved the report, attached it to an email, and sent it to her supervisor. With that done, she looked around her office and saw no pending piles of work. The day was not yet over, but she had handled the primary responsibilities. The remaining hours would likely be quiet, with only minor tasks popping up. She preferred it that way. Order and efficiency were part of her routine. She organized a few more files on her computer, then closed several tabs. The office remained quiet, with only faint sounds in the hallway. She confirmed that all the morning's tasks were completed. She had delivered the documents, submitted the report, and updated all necessary records. Everything was in proper order. A short while later, her phone rang. It was her supervisor. The call was brief. He thanked her for following through on the delivery and said that the department appreciated her efficiency. She acknowledged his words, said she was glad to help, and hung up. There was no need to discuss the details further. The job was done, and the consequences would unfold as they should. She logged out of a secure database and locked her computer. After a final glance around the office, she decided to head home a bit early if no one needed her. She peeked outside, saw the junior administrator in the hallway, and asked, "Do you need me for anything else today?" He shook his head. "No, I think we're good," he said. "All reports are in, and the schedule is clear. Have a good evening." She nodded and thanked him. Returning to her office, she gathered her personal items, her coat, her bag, and her folder. The folder was almost empty now, holding only the receipt of delivery. She placed it in her bag, making sure everything was secure. As she walked out, she passed the reception area. The same officer from before was still there, going through papers. He looked up and gave her a polite nod. She nodded back. There were no pending issues, nothing left unfinished. She pushed the exit door and stepped onto the street. The rain had stopped, the pavement was wet, and a few puddles reflected the dull sky. She zipped her jacket against the lingering chill and started walking. The route home would take her along familiar blocks. She would have a quiet evening and resume her duties tomorrow. Cars passed by at a moderate pace. A passerby adjusted an umbrella and stepped around a puddle. She walked steadily, aware that she had completed her responsibilities as required. She had followed the procedures, handled unexpected tension, and ensured the documents reached the right hands. A small grocery store caught her eye. She considered stopping in to pick up something for dinner. She decided to do it. Inside, the lights were bright, and the store smelled like fresh produce. She grabbed a few items, a loaf of bread, some vegetables, a carton of milk, and paid at the counter. The cashier offered a neutral greeting and handed her the change without comment. She thanked him and left. With the groceries in hand, she continued home. The evening air felt less harsh now. A few people were out on the sidewalks, some carrying briefcases, others walking dogs. Everything seemed normal and stable. She preferred it that way. After the events of the morning, she appreciated the calm routine of daily life. When she reached her apartment building, she used her key to enter the lobby and took the elevator up. Inside her apartment, the silence was welcoming. She hung her coat, placed the groceries on the kitchen counter, and set her bag on a chair. She would put things away in a moment. First, she removed the folder and the receipt form from her bag, placing them in a drawer where she kept records of completed tasks. She washed her hands and put the groceries into the fridge and pantry. Then she turned on a lamp in the living area and took a seat. She had time to relax now. There were no pending calls, no urgent emails. Everything was as it should be. Later, she might read or watch something on TV. She had no pressing matters to attend to. Tomorrow would bring another set of tasks at work, but nothing as tense or unusual as today's delivery. She accepted that not every day would be quiet, but at least she had managed this one well. With that, the story of the day ended. She had delivered the documents and completed her duties. The rest was out of her hands, just as the system intended.